Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My name is Soji Apampa, and I will be the moderator of this high-level forum for the private sector, jointly organized by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the United Nations Global Compact in the margins of the UN General Assembly. So we will be examining the role of the private sector in dealing with the issue of corruption, which we will all agree has become a very topical issue globally. With me today, we've got a number of speakers, starting with the Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Gadawali, and the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact, Sanda Ojiambo, who will both be joining us by video. We also have Ms. Benedict Fasma, who is the CEO of Sberbank One and a member of the FACTI panel. She is the Group Executive Officer of Sberbank One, SR Bank, which is the second largest bank in Norway. She has more than 25 years experience in the financial sector and in industry and shipping. Before her current position, she was head of corporate banking at DNB, the largest bank in Norway. Ms. Fasma is also member of the UN High-Level Panel on International Financial Accountability, Transparency and Integrity for Achieving the 2030 Agenda, or for short, the FACTI panel. The panel just recently issued a public report with its 14 main recommendations to foster financial integrity for sustainable development. Also with us this afternoon is Mr. Bernardo Vargas, who is the CEO of the ISA Group. Mr. Vargas is the CEO of Interconexión Eléctrica, short ISA, which is a multi-Latin company group operating throughout Latin America in the power, telecom, ICT, and highway concession sector. Before ISA, Mr. Vargas worked for about 20 years in various positions in investment banking. Prior to that, he served as advisor to the Minister of Foreign Trade of Colombia and worked at the Colombian Central Bank. Mr. Vargas is a board member of numerous nonprofits and is a regular mentor for young entrepreneurs. And last but not the least, we have Mr. Ashish Kumar Chauhan, who is CEO of what used to be the Bombay Stock Exchange, or BSE for short. So Mr. Kumar is CEO of BSE, which has a market capitalization of listed companies close to $3 trillion US. Under his leadership at BSE fall many remarkable achievements, such as helping it to become the fastest exchange in the world, reviving its revenues, and introducing mobile stock trading to India in a variety of areas. Mr. Kumar is also one of the founders of the National Stock Exchange in India, where he early introduced modern financial derivatives in the country. He teaches at several universities in the UK and Canada as a visiting professor and is a regular speaker at international conferences. A book titled Sthitpragya, The Process of Maintaining Equilibrium, has been written on his life's journey. So now join me in welcoming the video presentations by the executive directors of the UNODC and the UN Global Compact.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the high-level forum for the private sector, organized by UNODC and our partners at the UN Global Compact. Business and society have much to lose from corruption, but they also have the leverage to counter it. This forum recognizes the essential role of the private sector, and it provides a platform for the business community to contribute to global anti-corruption action. The political declaration adopted by the first ever General Assembly Special Session against corruption includes a commitment on the part of member states to provide stronger incentives for private sector companies to implement ethical business practices and to strengthen anti-corruption integrity and compliance efforts. To emerge from the current crisis stronger, more transparent, more accountable, and more resilient, we need clear commitment from the private sector in return. First, companies like yours need to join forces to improve integrity in your industries and supply chains. UNODC supports businesses in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to engage in collective action, and we stand ready to work with you. UNODC also helps cultivate a culture of integrity by offering resources and virtual tools in over 30 languages. Secondly, as integrity leaders, you need to invest more in education and training beyond your own company and include SMEs along the value chain. Businesses need to become more inclusive and diverse. Last year, UNODC published research showing that diversity breaks down networks that facilitate corruption. Having more women on company boards lowers fraud and bribery risks. Doing the right thing makes good business sense. This forum brings together business leaders who understand the challenges of keeping business clean and transparent, and who are committed to turning global anti-corruption commitments into real action. I look forward to hearing the outcomes of your discussion. Thank you.
Distinguished delegates, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am truly honored to join Undersecretary General Ghada Wali in welcoming you to today's high-level forum for the private sector. Ending corruption in all its insidious forms is key to the mission of the United Nations Global Compact. In fact, the 10th principle of our 10 universal principles for responsible, sustainable business is based on the UN Convention Against Corruption. By endorsing this principle, our participating companies make a commitment to avoid bribery, extortion, and all forms of corruption. They further commit to developing and enforcing proactive anti-corruption policies throughout their operations and their supply chains. We also challenge Global Compact signatories to work collectively towards a more transparent global economy with other businesses, governments, civil society, and the United Nations. The special session of the General Assembly against corruption arrives at a very critical point for the international community, very much so including the private sector. The COVID crisis has added an even greater urgency to our work on this issue. Corruption remains one of the greatest obstacles to economic and social development. It undermines the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, taints markets, and takes a heavy toll on the most vulnerable, especially in uncertain times. We must redouble our efforts to this scourge in the interest of achieving an equitable recovery from the crisis, accelerating progress on the 2030 Agenda, and finally, tackling the systemic inequalities that the pandemic has exposed and intensified. At the UN Global Compact, our strategic plan for the next 3 years aims to scale up the positive social impact of business by upholding all of the 10 principles and delivering on both the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. To succeed, we must hold companies accountable and foster business ecosystems that enable transformational change, which includes removing corruption from the equation once and for all. There is no more time to postpone that goal. The special session has to produce a shift that will lead to full implementation of the provisions of the UN Convention Against Corruption. Together, let us transform words and aspirations into concrete action. I am confident that we can seize this moment and get on with the business of building the better world that we all want. Thank you, and I wish you all a fruitful and actionable discussion today.
Thank you very much. And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. I wonder, did anything strike you particularly in these two speeches? that we have now received. Ashish, do you want to take a stab? Maybe something that you would have liked them to mention, or something that you want to strongly support?
No, I think I would like to support the framework of using private sector to reduce corruption or to eliminate corruption. And I think the entire framework of environmental sustainability or otherwise also, everything is achievable only if you can remove the corruption from the equation. And I think pretty much the focus of both the speeches was on that. And so I'm glad we are basically talking about the big white elephant in the room, which in some ways was not discussed so much before. And I think all the agencies are now sort of putting all their efforts in that direction. So I'm really delighted.
Okay, so maybe I should go to Bernardo now and ask okay, so they want the private sector to do a bit more about dealing with corruption, but do you really think the private sector is better suited than governments?
Well,
really,
thank you very much.
Yeah.
I come from Colombia, and I can certainly say that in Colombia, drug trafficking is our biggest problem and the corruption it fosters. So nothing better to hear multilateral organizations and companies across the world understanding that without the help of all, it's impossible for private companies to deal with this, especially in countries like Colombia. I very much liked three things that I heard right now: proactive work, collective work, and courageous work. Wow. Those three things are critical for us to push forward here. And without the support from global institutions and other corporations joining the fight, private sector companies and just the general public cannot be able to face such immense and critical risk. So that's my quick knee-jerk response.
Thank you so much, Bernardo. Maybe I should now turn to Benedict and just ask the substantive question. Do we now have stronger incentives for private sector companies to implement ethical business practices, as was demanded in the speech by the executive director of the UNODC, and to strengthen anti-corruption, integrity, and compliance efforts? It sounds like a lot to be expecting from the private sector. Sorry, you're muted at the moment. Yes. Great.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had problems with my unmute button. I think to answer your question, Soji, there are incentives, and unfortunately, they are not working well enough. And self-regulation, which has been, the key thing in the private sector so far, has proven to be insufficient and unreliable. And just the mere magnitude of this problem is something that struck me when working in the FACTI panel. With 10% of the world's GDP may be held in offshore financial assets, and 1 trillion US of global GDP is lost in money laundering every year, and it could finance 34 million nurses' salary in a year. So just the magnitude of the problem tells us that unless we all collaborate to do something differently, we will not be able to, as Bernardo just said, to combat the problem. And I think definitely the private sector should be a very important part of that solution.
Okay, thank you. So I'm hearing that from what Bernardo has said, and I think this can be trademarked, it needs to be proactive, collective, and courageous action from the private sector. And you've now spoken about collective action. If I remember correctly, you've spoken about regulation, I beg your pardon. Now, self-regulation, if I'm not mistaken, requires at least three things: that you know what standard you will be held to, that you have an internally motivating force keeping you focused on that objective, and then you have a desire to either avoid certain outcomes or accept certain outcomes. But there must be something driving you. But I'm understanding from you that it appears that that incentive and motivation framework is rather weak. So if that is weak, Ashish, what do we do if it is really difficult for us to sufficiently incentivize the private sector?
I think there are many ways you can kind of bell the cat, and in some ways, what India has done, I'll tell you. We have tried to automate the governance processes to the extent possible by providing people on their mobile access to governance activities, the activities relating to getting their certificates, their licenses, even the subsidies in their accounts, and so on and so forth. So a large portion of corruption, which was there due to the middleman between the government and the citizens, I think large portion of that has been reduced, and that has also given or set examples for every level of government to implement that. And of course, it helps that India is a IT superpower, so it's able to implement those things for the rest of the world. But now it's also doing it for itself. And the 4G telephone availability with smartphones in every nook and corner of India, with the literally 100 phones per 100 people, almost 1:1 number of phones, has also helped India kind of leapfrog the entire governance paradigm. That is what I call transactional corruption. By creating transparency of the processes, of outcomes and all, India has been able to do a wonderful job. The second portion, which is what I call the policy level of corruption, or policy corruption, which I think in some ways Bernardo kind of alluded to, that when the overwhelming activity is not what I call socially correct, it can actually corrupt the entire system in a deep way, which is hurting, but also overpowers everything else you do. And for me, India used to have deep policy corruption, but due to auctioning of resources, natural resources, and every part of transactions of governments, whether they are buying or selling, by automating them or auctioning those things, those also in some ways have been removed. So idea is somewhere you have to start, and modern technologies, if you use as a country, probably large portion of the corruption. I mean, corruption has many facets, but the day-to-day corruption which a user or a citizen feels is the what I call most pathetic. And if you can take care of that by automating and making people feel that they are valued, in some ways, India's progress is an example where even during COVID times, we have been able to feed 800 million people, that is US, Canada, and part of Latin America combined population, for 9 months free of cost. Food reaches them, the funds reaches people's accounts by click of a button by the governments. And literally the trains have been run, millions of sort of wagons of trains have been run across a continent-sized country to feed 800 million people from last April to December free. And again, June, that is starting now, and July, both months, 800 million people will get free food, free sort of oil, cooking, gas, and also a little bit of money in their pockets to buy things. And during the COVID period itself, for whatever reason, actually of the government, that the inflation has not taken off. Inflation has been very benign. And that is basically telling you that India's fintech, e-commerce, and the overall e-governance sort of activities have brought that change, because earlier, even the slightest issues and shortages used to erupt, and also there used to be huge sort of spikes in prices of essential goods. We have seen in last 2 months some issues relating to the prices of medicines for COVID that had gone up substantially. But India also manufactures most of the drugs, medicines for the world. And because of that, we could ramp up the production of vaccines and also remdesivir and other medicines. And now everything is pretty much controlled, and the prices have come down drastically. The number of infections per day, new infections per day, which used to be like 400,000 a day 2 months back, has now come down to 100,000 today. So slowly and steadily, we went from what I call economy of abundance to slight shortages in certain areas in last 2-3 months, and again we are going towards economy of abundance. So private sector has to start producing more, and that actually reduces corruption, in my opinion.
But Ashish, should I challenge what I'm hearing a bit, because I'm very excited by what I'm hearing. I'm very encouraged, but is this translating into improved perceptions of corruption in India?
Absolutely. In fact, in 1985, our Prime Minister of India, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, had said that if we are spending $1 on developmental activities, only 15 cents go to the beneficiaries, 85 cents get eaten up in the middle. And from 1985 to 2012, that 85 had gone to actually 95. So wow. If we were spending $1, 95 cents were eaten away. And now, actually, if we are trying to send $1 to the beneficiary, $1 reaches next moment into beneficiary's account, which is linked to his or her mobile phone. And even literally 10 cents can be sent zero cost, right? Even 10 cents. Of course, you can send $100,000 also. But the way the government has been able to connect people's bank accounts with their mobile numbers, and through that, everyone is able to transact using their mobile. So same money which government gives into their account is also now immediately they can use it to buy goods, services, and so on and so forth. And that's what has changed the perception. Of course, the government has also built a lot of houses, a lot of toilets, and many things which were kind of in a way on papers only, not in reality. Now, because of the way people are able to take mobile pictures, load them on the websites and Twitter and everything, and shame the governments if they actually claim wrong stuff. And sometimes we shame them more than what they deserve. But that's how we are. We try to show our shame 10 times more than what we actually have. And that's what the government keeps government on their toes. I think today we may have a situation where the entire leakages, which is reaching direct aid to the sort of investors or citizens, have come down pretty much in terms of the leakages have come down close to zero.
Okay, so wow, this is very exciting. Bernardo, it's sounding from everything that Ashish has said, in the case of India, that there would be strong incentive for private sector, because I can see business being developed, because yes, we're talking about the government has done this IT thing and that IT thing, but I know it's not the government. That would be a procurement, and the private sector will benefit from that. I also hear that the government is able to strengthen its monitoring role, because now it's able to better supervise its own expenditures. And you know, for regulation to work from government, it needs the capacity to monitor and to ensure that it is correcting behavior if modification is required along the way. But I'm also hearing that it's empowering citizens, for citizens to also get into the mix somehow, that between the private sector's actions, government actions using the tools, and the citizens keeping both sides honest with what they're able to share, that India is able to reduce corruption. Is this a model that we should be considering generally? ICT-driven opportunities for reducing corruption. Is this the panacea?
Well, I don't know if it's a panacea. Already Benedict mentioned that there's a lot of things to work with and a lot of challenges ahead. But Ashish pointed out to two things which I mentioned briefly initially, but I think, as you well mentioned, Soji, are key for the future, which is collective work and hyperconnectivity. You know, the fact that we have a society that's hyperconnected, it allows for, you know, the biggest incentive for companies to stand away from corruption is survivability today. I run a company that does engineering mostly, but our risks are not engineering wise, you know, are engineering based. Our risks for disappearing, for obsolescence are more related with corruption and with best practices. And that happens not only to us, and I can cite many examples of corporations across the world, car companies that lie on emission standards, giants in digital giants that have to face congressional questionnaires and so far. And so in order to survive, you have to be away from corruption. That's a very important thing in a hyper-connected society. But as Ashish pointed, I really truly believe, and you, I think, signaled that as well, you need to work collectively. How? State, corporations, and academia. Those three pillars together, I'm certain, can provide better standards to really measure what we're doing. And of course, as you mentioned, Soji, keep everybody honest. You know, you mentioned that. If you have three different collective players there, you will guarantee that everybody keeps honest. And when today the key risks will reduce your survivability, that in itself is a very good incentive to be clear on the fact that having strong anti-corruption mechanisms will provide your long-term survivability. But then the challenges have to do with sort of preaching that gospel to your contractors, to your suppliers, because doing to your people where your own incentives as an executive are tied to that is usually not a huge problem. But preaching that gospel to all your contractors, to all your suppliers, and to the general public is, I think, a key responsibility, not only for the government, but for corporations, the government, and academia.
Wow. I'm very excited about this response, Bernardo, because it opens two new routes that we can explore on the role of the private sector, because I think we can look at supply chain governance. Yes?
If I may,
yes.
Before you move on a new topic, because I think, you know, Bernardo and Ashish are raising very, very important points. And I think you also touched upon something very important, you know, how, you know, the standards to adhere to are so important in order for us to kind of keep honest and go in the right direction. And I'd like to touch upon some of the recommendations that I think are particularly relevant to the private sector, which we published from the FACTI panel. And I'll give you some examples why they are important. And the first one is to be transparent. I think it's quite important to start with multinationals. And as Bernardo said, you know, if you require something from your suppliers, particularly when they're big corporates and they have big contracts, you know, even smaller companies are you know, eager to adhere in order to get the business. So country by country reporting and transparency is one example. The other thing which I think is important is for investors to actually set standards and expectations to the companies they invest in. And I'll give you one example where the Norwegian, we call it the oil fund for short. I mean, the Norwegian government pension fund, one of the biggest investors in the world, they issue an expectation document where they stated the board should have policies, they should keep the management accountable, and they should review and take action, in case something is not in order. And they actually audit this on a regular basis. And if the company hasn't, done or lived up to standards, they actually divest. And for a big listed company to be divested from a serious investors based on the fact that they don't, keep up to good standards is actually quite self-regulating, if I could put it in that way.
Jump in before you go on and ask you the question about that, because I've spoken to a number of investors whether or not they're going to divest if they found challenges with the governance standard. But most of them keep saying, no, if it's a really good opportunity, we won't divest. What we will do, we will help them improve their governance, and something woolly like that.
Yeah.
I don't.
But the one I'm referring to is actually they do exactly that for a period to actually make the company improve or help them improve. But if they don't, they divest and they publicly state which companies they divest and why. So it's kind of shaming, if you wish.
Yes.
And that has quite an impact and is a very important self-regulating mechanism. Another thing which is more linked to some of the things that Ashish talked about is we recommend that there should be transparency on ultimate beneficiaries on, for instance, public contracts, and there should be open registries accessible. In my country, it's actually to the whole public, but I mean, and that's not part of the culture in all countries, but at least it should be accessible to the government and the government officials. And to have, standards and systems for transparency and data on ownership, is actually quite important, because as she's also touched upon, when you honor or issue government contract, you should require it to be ultimate owners displayed and part. Otherwise, they will not be able to bid or win the contract. And one country which actually implemented that with great success was Slovakia, where they had a huge problem with corruption. And they did, for all the public contracts, they said that they needed, beneficial ultimate owners on every contract. And it has taken down corruption tremendously. And the last thing I think I'd like to just mention to you, I know it's more to the policy makers and politicians than it is to private sector, but we also, the most controversial recommendation we made in my opinion, from the FACTI panel, was that we recommended all countries to have a minimum corporate tax rate of 25%. And I must admit, it surprised me when the first country to actually state that they would like to implement it and encourage other countries to do so as well was the US, and has been followed by Germany and France. And why? Because the race to the bottom on tax gives incentives to move money around, right? So I also think that's one of the important measures that would again drive private sector behavior.
Wow, fantastic. Thanks, Benedict, because I think you're giving us the keys for identifying the key incentives that private sector needs in order to do the right thing. So what I'm hearing is that, well, for SMEs, being in the supply chain of a larger company be an incentive, especially if that larger company is trying to be compliant. Then they're going to cascade it. So that could take care of SMEs, not all SMEs, but at least some SMEs. Then investors. If the investors in the large corporates are able to insist on standards and try to ensure that those standards are met. And if they're not met, if they would be activist about it by divesting, that would be a strong incentive as well. And that if we had open registers, we had beneficial ownership registers and so on, and it's required as part of certain types of procurement, public procurement, then it could be a disincentive for the collusion that sometimes happen between public officials and the private sector and so on. And also the issue of tax and not having slush money. So I don't know which of the gentlemen would like to take this, because I can almost see for Bernardo whether this will work in Latin America, and for Ashish also whether this is strong enough, if you think, because I think both India and Latin America, like Africa, will have a big political economy issue.
Without a doubt.
Implementing these things, that even though it's there, it's very clear that it's powerful and it can be made to work, but will the policymakers accept? Will they even dare try to implement, because of the way our leadership in our areas emerge? So if we look at the way the leaders emerge and the kind of hand-in-glove relationship they have with the private sector and various other actors, can we really push these kinds of agendas in India or Latin America or Africa, for that matter?
Well, Benedict mentions how international leadership can push forward taxation standards that better everybody. And I think that the big challenge here is, of course, in political systems and the way that democracies are electing their elected officials, because that has to do a lot with standards. But I think that in general, international practices will push that forward. And I have to say, regarding the previous discussion, and I would love to see Ashish's view on this, I think that investors are also evolving in a positive fashion. I think that more and more big investors are pushing for standards that everybody has to comply with. And that, of course, trickles down to the economy, which is led by innovation and by startups, which at the end are funded by these international financial trends. So I think that there's I'm an optimistic at heart, but there's sort of a virtuous cycle there. And also I think that has to be fostered within corporations by collective action. In Colombia, 35 companies in the electrical sector pushed together to sign a collective pronunciation on corruption and how standards have to be played. If many companies join, that will push forward for everybody to join. So that's the push from the private sector. And also, I think that we have a say in criticizing political systems in the midst of international standards to make them more progressive, more subject to standards that will prevent corruption. So I think it's a collective work, as I have mentioned throughout this interview. But I think that I'm positive, and I think that those challenges have to be led by international organizations, top down, but also the bottom up effort has to be in the way that we can push forward by corporations. In Latin America, our corporation touches 160 million people. And we have a lot of SMEs there. If we need to have these preaching this gospel, we have to do it from where we can help. And I think that ties in a bit at Benedict's comments.
No, I think
okay.
Basically, I think
thank you very much, Bernardo. Ashish, any comments?
Yep, I think I would just take on from where Benedict and Bernardo both said. Basically, for me, the transparency is the best disinfectant. So if you can bring transparency into the decision making, into contract sort of advertisement and also execution, it takes away a lot of such issues. And in India, all public decisions, you can actually ask for even the most details from the government, and they have to provide by law. They have to provide any information on a decision taken by any government authority and within a particular time frame. And so it's under an act called RTI, the Right to Information Act. And it is amazing how literally millions of people have become specialists just asking questions to the government, including the competitors to the people who have not got the contracts and so on and so forth. So it's becoming a very, very competitive market and very transparent situation currently. And similarly, all the public procurement happens through the auctions and also on websites called GEM, that is Government E-Procurement website. And so pretty much the ICT, as Bernardo said, is actually taking off. But on the question of 25% minimum corporate tax, India has that. Only my worry, which is going to be there even if you implement the tax across the world, is that tax on what? Tax on profits, but then profits are easy to manipulate, right? And so unless you define what is the sale and what is the procurement cost, you can't define the profits. And of course, the all other things about the royalties and so on and so forth. So for me, it's going to be sort of still a lot of arbitrage available. At the same time, a minimum tax will bring everyone on par. And India is pretty much saying this for last probably 30, 40 years, because India has seen huge amount of capital flight due to all this for last literally 70 years. And we have been advocating this at every forum that is talking about this. But somehow now I think every government is spending more than what they collect. So now they are also trying to worry about taxing the corporates and so on and so forth. But for me, what India did, interestingly, on indirect tax collection, that is the production tax and sales tax, we overhauled the entire 1.4 billion people's country, 30 states, into something new called GST, Goods and Services Tax, which is completely, again, ICT based. And for me, ICT is not government created. It's the private sector which has kind of offered those solutions to the government, and they are maintaining for the government and stuff like that. And that is now checking every bill on real time. Every transport of goods are being actually tallied against every bill. So literally the leakages are coming down, and many people did not like it when it was implemented. Today also, one of our ex-finance ministers said that that tax is bad because it is actually taxing people. Earlier, tax was only to show that you need to tax people, and honest people were paying, dishonest people were not paying. And that was creating a situation where only dishonest businesses were surviving. Now, everyone has to change their colors, everyone has to change their life, and it's not being liked by many. But whoever survives will be actually the right guys, and the new guys will take the places of the guys who are actually going out of business. So for me, it's absolutely important that when you take these reforms, as you rightly said, Sadi, whether the government has the will, they may get elected on those promises, but when they come to the power, actually they don't do it. Well, as what we have seen is, even if you're if one government out of 10 governments is able to do it, it changed the country in a way which is unheard of, unthinkable in a very short time. Earlier, the change used to take literally 2-3 decades. Now changes can happen in 2-3 years, right? And that's what the lesson from India is, that you can change a country with 1.5 billion people in 2 years' time in indirect taxes, in direct taxes, in subsidy distribution, in food distribution, and every aspect of life which affects, and also intermediaries take away a lot of money. The services don't reach the citizens. All these things, in my opinion, last 10 years, India has done some wonderful work, and including in fintech, that today from any bank, anywhere in India, to any bank anywhere in India, in your account, I can send even 1 cent without cost, right? And complete surety that it is going to reach your account. Those kind of stuff was only when we were reading in fairy tales that somewhere it'll happen. US doesn't do it, Europe doesn't do it, India does it, right? And that's what, for me, matter of pride, that somehow that public pressure on the government forced the governments to take it. Of course, they could have avoided it, but somehow some governments did not avoid and actually ended up implementing, which is becoming a phenomenal, what I call rocket fuel for the growth of the economy.
Okay, so from what we've been discussing so far, I think we can safely say we've been looking carefully, and this is for the audience, at how the private sector can become influential allies and strategically join forces with the government and civil society to reinforce collective action by leveraging and strengthening the business case for collective action, which ensures greater take-up and buy-in from the private sector. I think that is what we've been discussing. We've also dabbled in looking at supply chain governance, how the private sector can invest more in education and training beyond their immediate company into their supply chain to include SMEs along the value chain. So it's sounding to me that yes, the private sector does have a very strong role in dealing with corruption, but it's not in the ways that governments have been going about it. Because I'm hearing exciting things from India, that private sector's innovation is helping to deal with corruption. I'm hearing that private sector's engagement in governance, in the value chain, that is also strengthening transparency. I'm hearing that its own internal rules for dealing with investors and the relationship with investors can be very strong, because investors want to know your business model. They want to know how you actually make money before they take a share of it. They want to know. So if your business model is based on corrupt practices, then they don't want anything to do with it. So I'm not sure that governments actually understand that these are the things that drive business. Sometimes when you talk incentive in front of a government official, he says, no, we're not giving any tax holidays. Because they immediately think that's what the private sector is after. You're after some kind of differential advantage to take advantage of some government policy at the expense of other players. So is it something in the way that we engage with government and the relationship with government that is making it a little hard for governments to shift and understand the leverage for the private sector, so we can unlock and unleash the power of the private sector in causing change to happen? I don't know what you think, Benedict.
Oh, I think you have an extremely interesting point. And I think somehow, as we've touched upon, you have the different participants in the society, and where we've highlighted the government, the civil society, private sector, as well as academia. And but I think one thing we have to remember is that in order to have the illicit financial flow move around, we need an infrastructure, right? Ashish mentioned that corruption has come down due to the use of mobile phones, which is again the infrastructure for money moving from one person to another on the mobile. And I think in that regard, the financial institutions or the banks or mobile companies, whoever carries the money from A to B, do play an important role as part of public sector. And in some countries, particularly in the United States and in Europe, the demands on the financial institutions on anti-money laundering, policies and compliance is extremely hard, and it's actually the bank managers are put to jail if they don't have a clean infrastructure in place in where you actually monitor the flows going in and out. The other kind of group of firms in the private sector who we may want to help also to become or perform better are the what we call the enablers, or the advisors, the legal firms, the auditors, you know, all those type of advisors who actually facilitate or advise how to move money, you know, into different or more shady corners of the world. And I think one of the intermediaries, thank you. And one of the things that I've been asked to work on together with one other member of the FACTI panel is actually some recommendations as to standards for the intermediaries, so they have something to start from. And as you put it extremely well earlier on, where you said that, you know, you have to start with the standards, you know, what to adhere to in order to know where, you know, where you're moving or within which borders you're moving. And we're trying to publish that later in the year or hopefully before summer, to help also to push the movement a little bit on that front.
Okay, so speaking about the intermediaries, this is really interesting because for a long time, until the Panama Papers exposed the role of lawyers and accountants and real estate agents and so on, everyone pretended that it was just the public sector that was involved with corruption. And at a stretch, yes, they had some private sector partners because, as was always mentioned, it took two to tango. But it sounds more not like a tango, but like a wrestling match, where there's actually a referee in the middle, and the referee are the intermediaries. And so the boxer on this side, the boxer on that side, they both knock each other out, but the referee goes away untouched by what is going on. And it's time to really lay hold, because they're also part of the private sector. So just to ask, with the few minutes we've got left, what exactly can be done about these intermediaries? You talked about standards, and we've got COSO 2013, we've got COSO 2017, we've got the we've got the ISO standard 37001, and so on. We've got these things. So who's asking for certification of these firms and requiring it? Because accountants and lawyers help you set up your organization, but theirs is a mess, and no one's asking them how they're set up and whether they have proper governance. Nobody asks for the governance of these firms. So is there something that we can recommend or something we can do in that area as well?
I beg to differ a little bit by that nobody questions these intermediaries. I think that they are firms as we are. And, you know, Benedict's bank due diligence since me when he lends me money. And when I do that, I also due diligence the intermediary and so on and so forth. So I think that bad apples, examples that are given by bad apples, Panama Papers, Odebrecht, they raise the standards for everybody. And I think that's good in order to be everybody on that new standard. And I think that also the fact that we need to be more and more, especially large corporations, part of international standards of the Dow Jones or the FTSE standards or others is also important for all firms, not only for firms that are in the real sector or the financial sector. All intermediaries more and more have to be compliant with that. So I'm confident that, but also it's important to communicate, Soji. I think that private firms are good at setting standards, at going by them, but we're not good at communicating to society as all, to governments, to our peers, and to people, because I think that at the end of the day, what we need is a cultural change where everybody can be raising these standards collectively. I know it's a huge dream, but I think that we have to live with dreams. If not, corruption is unbeatable.
Wow. Okay. Ashish, any comments?
in some ways, I think intermediaries are a very important part, and the KYCs and all the transaction scrutinies, including the accountants who are the big four or big five. One of them keeps on dropping out with a scandal, and the new one emerges, and the old one emerges with the newer names and things like that. And so basically, there are what I call formal and informal multinational sort of conglomerates of these intermediaries, this information or intermediaries, which also give you the best practices of how to avoid taxes vis-a-vis how to save taxes. And there is a very thin line between the two, right? And so on and so forth. So they actually create industrial scale situations out of what I call small little infractions. And so how do we basically, as because I also wear hat of public authority as a stock exchange head, and somewhere on the line, what we try to do is to basically act as a people who give signals. People think that stock exchange role is to allow you to transact, but that's a very, what I call, a very down to earth operational role. The largest portion or largest thing we do is to give you signals about virtue, about creating that trust in people, so that unknown people, people who have not seen you from Norway, from Colombia, there are Japan, people are investing in Indian companies, and they have to have that trust that these people who are taking the money, that company which they are investing in, is kosher, is going to do things correctly, and as and when profits are made, it'll be coming back to them in the proportion in which they have the shares. And so for me, what we do is every time a company has a material event, they have to disclose to the markets, and we actually scan literally millions of websites and Twitter and Facebook and what you have on using artificial intelligence and data mining to check whether even any rumors are going about the company. And then we ask the question to the company saying, is something like this happening in Nigeria with you or in Brazil with you? And a company has to answer. If they don't answer, again, the investors get to know that this company is not answered in 3 hours or 5 hours. And so it's putting tremendous pressure. For me, that signaling of virtue and making things transparent put together is a huge boon. We can't, what I call, overcome everything, but large portion of that is overcome using these two methods. Third method which we use is in Indian Companies Act, there is a new method called majority of minority. Whenever the people who are managing the show, if they have any interest in the particular resolution of the company, they have to stay away from voting on that. Their votes don't count. And so the majority of the minority people who are not interested in the company, who are not running the company, have to take that decision. So we are trying to basically think through many of such issues and create what I call creative answers to sort of box and make the box little smaller and smaller at every step. That private sector corruption or public sector corruption, for me, both are two sides of the same coin. And so there is no private sector corruption without public sector corruption, and without, I mean, there is no private sector. I mean, the public sector cannot say that we are the only corrupt people. There has to be the other side on private sector, and of course the intermediaries, as you rightly said. And so we need to catch each of them, shame them, name them, and make all their activities transparent. One of the last issues which we have seen is
I'm going to have to jump in because sadly we've run out of time. We've spent a whole hour. We've got just a minute left. This has been a wonderful time with the three of you. We thank you very much, Mr. Ashish Kumar from the Bombay, what used to be the Bombay Stock Exchange. We have Benedict Fasma as well from, apologies, Benedict, I was just looking
from
for
Norway.
the name of the bank again. Yes, from Spare Bank 1. Thank you. Apologies. And we have Bernardo Vargas from ISA. Thank you so much, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. We could have gone on for another hour, and I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you in this panel. Thank you very much. We'll have to leave it here for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hello to my partner.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.